Pathetic. You can't even serve a glass of wine without ruining everything.
Pathetic. You can't even serve a glass of wine without ruining everything. Nathaniel Whitmore's furious voice thundered through the luxury restaurant, his finger stabbing the air toward Grace. The crimson spill bled across the white tablecloth, shards of crystal sparkling like knives at her feet. Gasps rose from nearby tables as all eyes locked on the confrontation. Eleanor Whitmore, his mother, stood beside him, her elegant hands clutching his arm, trying to calm the storm boiling inside her son. Though she couldn't hear the outrage in his voice, she read it in his lips, in the tremor of his body. A moment earlier, the two had been exchanging quick gestures, silent words that no one around them understood, until Grace appeared at their table. The chandelier lights flickered against a room frozen in disbelief. Grace stood still, her eyes steady, her silence sharper than any defense. What no one yet knew was that this night would unravel secrets powerful enough to leave everyone in shock. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The chandelier trembled with the murmur of shocked whispers, its crystals scattering fractured light over linen-draped tables. A bottle of red wine lay on its side, bleeding across the white cloth like a wound that would never wash out. Shards of crystal glass sparkled in the mess, and in the middle of it stood Grace Miller, hands clenched at her sides, her breath caught in her chest. Opposite her, Nathaniel Whitmore's voice thundered through the luxury restaurant, sharp enough to silence even the soft piano in the corner. "Do you call this service?" he barked, pointing an accusatory finger so close it nearly grazed her face. His tailored navy suit gleamed under the golden lights, but his expression twisted with contempt. Grace didn't move. She had learned long ago that silence could be a shield, even when humiliation seared her cheeks. Around them, guests froze mid-bite, forks suspended, lips parted in disbelief. Their polished world had been pierced, and now all eyes belonged to the spectacle. Beside Nathaniel sat his mother, Eleanor Whitmore, elegant in black with a string of pearls resting against her throat. Her silver hair was perfectly coiled, her posture as regal as the portraits of society matriarchs in the old downtown galleries. She tugged at her son's sleeve, eyes flicking between his rage and the waitress's stillness. Though she could not hear his fury, she could read the storm in his body, and it unsettled her. "I asked for excellence, and you give me this," Nathaniel sneered, sweeping his arm over the stained table. The motion sent another glass tumbling, shattering at Grace's feet. Gasps echoed, sharp and collective, as though the entire room had inhaled at once. Grace swallowed hard. The copper taste of shame lingered on her tongue, but she did not lower her gaze. Instead, her eyes locked on his, steady, unyielding. It was a dangerous kind of defiance, quiet, invisible to most, but enough for Nathaniel to sense. His nostrils flared. "Say something," he demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Or are you as useless as you look?" A hush fell heavier than velvet curtains. From the far tables, men in suits exchanged nervous glances. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, while another leaned forward, eager to witness whether the fragile waitress would dare confront the billionaire whose name opened doors across New York. Grace's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence was not surrender. It was calculation. In the trembling of her hands and the steady fire in her eyes lived the seed of something neither Nathaniel nor Eleanor could yet see. Eleanor reached again for her son's arm, this time with firmer fingers, her expression a plea. But Nathaniel brushed her off, his fury consuming the last traces of decorum. Grace finally drew in a breath, her voice quiet, but cutting through the stunned air. "Do you really want everyone here to know what kind of man you are?" The chandelier's glow seemed to dim. Forks clattered back to plates. The room held its breath, and for a single taut second, even Nathaniel Whitmore himself faltered. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as the sting of Grace's words lingered in the silence. He straightened, smoothing his suit with an exaggerated gesture, as if brushing off the stain of her defiance. His eyes flicked across the restaurant, making sure he still owned the room. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned to his mother. Eleanor adjusted her pearl necklace, her face composed, but her fingers trembling slightly as they rose from her lap. She began to sign, the movements elegant and practiced, a language of hands and silence that had always bound her and her son in a world apart. "Calm down, Nathaniel. People are watching." Nathaniel's lips twitched, but instead of replying with words, his hands joined hers, slicing through the air with controlled precision. "Let them watch. They don't understand anyway. This is between us." His movements were quick, deliberate, and shielded by the angle of his body. Grace, standing only a few feet away, pretended to busy herself with clearing the shattered glass. Her fingers trembled as she gathered the shards, but her eyes, discreet, unblinking, followed every flick of Nathaniel's hands. She had not seen those signs in years, not since her volunteer work at the community center. But the language once learned never truly left you. Eleanor's brow furrowed as she signed back, slower, her hands weaving with practiced grace. "You promised this would be discreet. These people, they know you, they respect us, don't ruin it." Nathaniel leaned closer, his smile painted on for the onlookers, though his hands told a different story. "Respect? They'll respect me more when I own half this block. The land is worthless in their hands. Families clinging to dirt they don't deserve. Once I sell it, no one can stop me." Grace's breath caught. She almost dropped the broken glass she was collecting. Her chest tightened as she recognized the names flickering in his gestures. The Martins, the Ruiz family, the old tailor whose shop sat just around the corner. Faces she knew, people who scraped together rent month after month. Her knuckles whitened around the shards. She forced herself to keep moving, to look like nothing more than a nervous waitress cleaning up her mistake. But inside, her heart pounded against her ribs like a warning drum. Nathaniel's fingers slashed the air with a cruel finality. Even Brooks, his precious restaurant, it's sitting on prime real estate. Once he's gone, the rest will crumble like dominoes. Grace's eyes flicked to the far end of the room, where the owner, Daniel Brooks, stood behind the bar, unaware of the noose tightening around his livelihood. Her pulse quickened. The betrayal in Nathaniel's signs was not just against strangers, it was against the very man who had given her a job when she had nowhere else to go. Eleanor hesitated, her hands folding in her lap. Her gaze darted toward Grace, who knelt gathering fragments of glass near their feet. For a moment their eyes met, an instant of silent suspicion, almost as if the older woman sensed that the waitress saw more than she let on. Nathaniel didn't notice. His grin widened as he leaned back, signaling one last word with a flick of his wrist. Untouchable. Grace lowered her eyes quickly, but her mind raced. She had heard enough to know what he planned. The question was whether she would dare to use that knowledge. The hum of conversation slowly returned to the restaurant, like timid waves after a storm, but Grace could still feel the weight of Nathaniel's fury pressing against her skin. She straightened the table with careful hands, laying a fresh cloth over the crimson spill. Yet her thoughts weren't on the mess. They were trapped in the flurry of shapes Nathaniel's fingers had carved in the air. She moved quietly between tables, her tray balanced as if nothing had happened. To the wealthy guests she was invisible again, just another servant blending into the crystal and velvet. But in her mind, she replayed every gesture, every name he had signed. Martins, Ruiz, Brooks. The names were like echoes from her own life. The Martins lived 2 streets from where Grace rented a single room in Queens. Mr. Ruiz's daughter had once attended the very community center where Grace had volunteered, teaching deaf children to sign. And Daniel Brooks, the man who had hired her when no one else would, was more than an employer. He had treated her with respect, like family. Grace's pulse raced. She knew what Nathaniel's words meant. It wasn't just a business deal. It was eviction, ruin, displacement. It was power disguised as progress. She reached the bar and set down her tray, her fingers tightening around the wood as if it could anchor her. Across the room, Nathaniel laughed at something Eleanor had signed. His voice had returned, smooth and commanding, as though the earlier eruption had been a performance, nothing more. Guests smiled nervously, eager to stay in his favor. Grace's jaw clenched. She knew his type. Men like Nathaniel didn't see people. They saw property, pawns, obstacles, and he was ruthless enough to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to the afternoons at the community center. She could still see the small, determined hands of children spelling out words, eager to be understood. Their laughter had been silent but bright, like sunlight on glass. It was there she had learned patience. There she had discovered how language could bridge worlds. She hadn't thought about it in years, but tonight in this glittering restaurant that forgotten skill returned like a lifeline. A tray clattered nearby, jolting her back. Chloe, another waitress, gave her a quick look. "You okay?" she whispered, concern threading through her voice. Grace forced a smile. "Yeah, just long night." But her eyes betrayed her, darting once more toward Nathaniel. Chloe followed her gaze, frowning at the powerful man, whose name carried weight in every corner of the city. "Stay out of his way," Chloe murmured. "Men like him, you don't win against them." Grace nodded, but inside, the words sparked resistance. Don't win, or don't try. She returned to the table, her heart steadying with each step. Nathaniel barely glanced at her, already immersed in another conversation. But Grace saw more than words. She saw his hands twitch occasionally, restless, betraying his need to control everything, even silence. As she poured wine into Eleanor's glass, she caught another glimpse of his signing. Just fragments this time, but enough. Papers. Deadline. No choice. The stem of the bottle trembled in her grip. She steadied it, forcing her breath calm, hiding the storm building inside. She could no longer pretend she hadn't seen. Nathaniel's voice rose again, smooth and cutting. "Careful, waitress. Don't spill twice." Grace met his eyes, her expression unreadable. She lowered the bottle with precision and stepped back. But in her silence, she carried a secret, heavier than the richest wine cellar, one that could shatter his empire if she dared to speak. Grace retreated to the service corridor for a moment, her breath shallow as she leaned against the cool wall. The muffled laughter of wealthy diners seeped through the doorway, but her thoughts had already slipped years into the past. She remembered the first time she saw hands moving in rhythm, weaving stories without sound. She had been 16, sitting on the cold tile floor of a community center in Queens, waiting for her shift as a volunteer. A boy with dark curls had tugged her sleeve, his eyes wide with hope, then lifted his hands and shaped the word friend. She hadn't understood at first, but he repeated it, patient, smiling. And Grace, clumsy and uncertain, copied the motion until he laughed. No sound, just light breaking across his face. From that day on, she stayed longer after her shifts. She learned from the children, from the teachers, from books she borrowed and returned late. She practiced signing to herself in the mirror, fumbling at first, then slowly building fluency. It became her private language, one she carried long after she had left the center behind. But life had a way of pulling her into survival. Bills, rent, the endless carousel of jobs that treated her like furniture. The signs faded into memory, until tonight, when Nathaniel Whitmore's cruel fingers resurrected them with every calculated flick. Grace pressed her palms together now, almost unconsciously, forming the shape of strength. She whispered the word under her breath, tasting the courage she wasn't sure she had. The kitchen door swung open, startling her back into the present. Chloe appeared, balancing a tray. "You hiding?" she teased lightly, but her eyes softened when she saw the strain on Grace's face. "Just catching my breath," Grace said, forcing a small smile. "You're tougher than you think," Chloe murmured, before disappearing again into the crowded room. Grace stood there, the echo of those words mingling with the memory of children's silent laughter. She remembered one girl in particular, Maria, tiny, stubborn, with a smile too big for her small frame. Maria had once signed to Grace with fierce determination, "Don't be afraid to speak for us. Some of us can't." That memory returned now with the weight of prophecy. Grace realized she wasn't just overhearing Nathaniel's greed. She had been given a choice, whether to remain invisible or to carry the voices of those who couldn't defend themselves. She straightened her uniform, smoothing the wrinkles from her vest. Her reflection in the hallway mirror looked tired, yes, but there was something new in her eyes, an ember of resolve. When she stepped back into the dining room, the light felt harsher, the chandeliers more oppressive. Nathaniel sat at his table, his expression calm now, almost smug. Eleanor watched him carefully, her hands folded, but her silence carried unease. Grace walked past them with steady steps, tray balanced, posture tall. Her mind replayed Maria's sign again and again. Don't be afraid to speak. And in that moment, Grace knew, sooner or later she would. The night carried on with forced elegance. Silverware chimed, waiters moved in silent choreography, and the piano resumed its gentle notes. Yet beneath the surface, tension pulsed like an undercurrent no one dared to name. Grace approached Nathaniel's table with fresh plates, her hands steady though her heart drummed in her chest. She set down the seared salmon before Eleanor, then leaned to place Nathaniel's dish. Just as she lowered it, his hand shot out, seizing her wrist. The clink of porcelain meeting crystal echoed louder than it should have. Conversations faltered. Grace froze, her tray hovering in midair, his grip cold and firm against her skin. "Do you think I don't see you?" Nathaniel's voice cut through the room, sharp as broken glass. "Always lingering, always watching, distracted. You're paid to serve, not to stare." Gasps fluttered across nearby tables. Grace pulled her hand back, forcing composure. "I wasn't—" But he interrupted, leaning forward, his tone dripping with venom. "You weren't what? Spying? Daydreaming? If this is the best Brooks can hire, no wonder his restaurant barely stays afloat." Grace felt the weight of every gaze pressing on her shoulders. Heat rushed to her face, but she held her ground, refusing to shrink. "I do my job," she said quietly. Nathaniel smirked, savoring the spotlight. "Then prove it, because one more slip, one more distraction, and you're gone. Do you understand?" His words rang out like a verdict, loud enough for every patron to hear. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably beside him, her eyes narrowing as if she wanted to intervene. She lifted her hands slightly, but Nathaniel pressed a palm down on the table, stopping her. The pearls at her neck trembled with the rise and fall of her breath. Grace lowered her gaze, not out of defeat but to mask the storm behind her eyes. "Yes, sir," she murmured. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the tray. Nathaniel released her with a dismissive flick, leaning back in his chair. "Good. Know your place." The words lingered like smoke in the air. Grace turned and walked toward the bar, her steps measured, each one a battle to keep from collapsing under the humiliation. The murmur of whispers swelled behind her, some sympathetic, others merely curious at the spectacle of power-crushing dignity. At the bar, Daniel Brooks had emerged from the kitchen, concern etched across his face. He had seen enough to sense what was happening, though not the full scope. His jaw tightened as he watched Grace fight to hold her head high. Nathaniel lifted his wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid, his voice loud enough to reclaim the room. "This is what happens when standards slip," he announced, half to his mother, half to the guests. "Mediocrity breeds mediocrity." The room responded with uncomfortable silence, no applause this time, only the brittle sound of cutlery resuming its work. Grace steadied herself behind the bar, her chest rising and falling. The sting of his words cut deep, but beneath the pain, something else began to burn. His arrogance, his cruelty, it wasn't invincible. She carried a truth in her hands that could unravel everything he thought he controlled, and with every humiliating word he hurled at her, the weight of her silence became harder to bear. Grace stood frozen behind the bar, her fingers wrapped around the stem of an empty glass she hadn't realized she was holding. Nathaniel's words still rang in her ears, cruel and final. But louder than his insult was the memory of his hands moving in secret, spelling out the fate of families who had no idea their homes and livelihoods were being bargained away. She inhaled slowly, as if drawing courage from the very air, then set the glass down. Her reflection in the polished counter stared back at her, tired, fragile, but with a spark she hadn't seen in years. Maria's words from the past returned like a whisper. "Don't be afraid to speak for us." Grace stepped out from behind the bar, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The restaurant hummed with forced chatter, guests desperate to move past the spectacle of humiliation. Nathaniel, glass in hand, was already charming another table, his laughter smooth, his arrogance restored. She approached slowly, each step measured, as though walking a tightrope suspended above silence. When she stopped at his table, the laughter around him stuttered and fell away. Nathaniel looked up, surprise flashing across his face. "What now?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. Grace's throat tightened, but she forced the words out, clear and steady. "I know what you're doing, Mr. Whitmore. The room froze. Forks clinked onto plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eleanor's eyes snapped to Grace, sharp with sudden fear. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his smile. "Do you, now?" Grace lifted her hands, mirroring the very language he thought was hidden. Her fingers shaped the words carefully, deliberately, and her voice carried them into the air. Martins, Ruiz, Brooks, deadline, no choice. A ripple of shock spread through the restaurant. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her chest. Nathaniel's smirk faltered for the first time that night. Grace pressed on, louder now, her voice trembling but unrelenting. "How you sit here mocking the people who serve you, while plotting to strip families of their homes. Even this restaurant," she gestured around them, her hand shaking, "you called it nothing more than land to sell, to destroy." Murmurs erupted across the room, outrage simmering like fire catching dry wood. Guests turned to one another, their whispers sharp, their eyes locked on Nathaniel. He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough!" he barked, though his voice cracked under the weight of exposed truth. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But Eleanor's face told another story. Her lips trembled, her hands half lifted as though to sign a question, a denial. But no movement came, only silence. Grace's voice softened, but the words struck with precision. "Don't deny it. I saw your hands, every word, every name. You thought no one could understand, but I did. And now, so does everyone else." The chandelier above seemed to flicker, as if the entire room leaned into her words. Nathaniel's power, once absolute, cracked under the weight of revelation. And for the first time, he had no clever retort, no mocking laugh, only silence pressing in from every corner of the room. The silence in the restaurant was thick enough to suffocate. Guests leaned forward in their seats, their jeweled earrings and cufflinks glinting under the chandelier, waiting to see if the billionaire's arrogance could withstand the fragile waitress's daring accusation. Nathaniel's jaw twitched, his lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth, but before the first excuse could slip out, Grace raised her hands again. Her movements were steady, deliberate. One by one, she shaped the signs Nathaniel had used only minutes earlier. Martins, Ruiz, Brooks, papers, deadline, no choice. Each gesture struck like a hammer, echoing through the hushed room. Eleanor's eyes widened. She leaned forward, watching Grace's hands as though seeing a ghost. The waitress's signing was not clumsy or uncertain. It was fluent, precise, undeniable. The very language Eleanor had believed was private between her and her son now betrayed him, carried by the hands of a woman he had just ridiculed. Gasps rippled across the tables. A man in a tuxedo muttered to his wife, "She's repeating him, word for word." The woman's hand clutched her pearls, her gaze snapping toward Nathaniel with disgust. Nathaniel's face flushed, a sheen of sweat forming along his temple. He slammed his fist against the table again, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Grace turned directly to Eleanor, her hands still moving, her voice narrating every gesture. "He promised to sell the land. He said the families don't deserve it. He said even your restaurant, Mr. Brooks, will fall like dominoes." From the back of the room, Daniel Brooks appeared, drawn by the commotion. His eyes narrowed as he caught Grace's words. "What did you just say?" Grace didn't falter. She signed again, this time slower, giving Eleanor every chance to see, to understand. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap, her lips parting as if to form words she could not voice. She turned to her son, horror carved into every line of her face. Nathaniel hissed under his breath, leaning toward her. "Mother, don't listen, she's twisting it." But Eleanor lifted her hand sharply, silencing him without a word. For the first time that evening, it was she who commanded the room. Her gaze locked on Grace, then drifted back to her son. The betrayal in her eyes was unmistakable. Whispers turned into open outrage. A businessman rose from his table, shaking his head. "You'd ruin families for profit?" Another voice joined in. "And use your own mother's silence to hide it." Nathaniel's composure cracked, his polished mask slipping away under the weight of their stares. He reached for his glass, but his hand shook too violently to lift it. Grace lowered her hands at last, her chest rising and falling with quiet intensity. She had given the room everything it needed, truth spoken in a language meant to be secret, truth that no denial could erase. Eleanor finally lifted her trembling fingers, signing slowly, painfully, as if each movement tore at her heart. Is it true? The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and merciless. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his lips dry, his voice caught in his throat. For the first time all evening, the billionaire had no control. The restaurant no longer belonged to Nathaniel Whitmore. The chandeliers still glowed, the waiters still moved with trained elegance, but every pair of eyes in that gilded room had shifted, away from his polished exterior, away from his wealth, and onto the cracks spreading through him like glass about to shatter. Eleanor's question still lingered in the air. Is it true? Her trembling hands made the words heavy, unescapable. Nathaniel's throat worked as he tried to swallow, but no words came. He looked at his mother, her pearls catching the light, her eyes shimmering with something he hadn't seen in years: betrayal. For so long, she had defended him, believed in him, carried the family name like a crown. And now that crown had slipped, leaving him exposed before the people whose admiration he had fed on. Whispers churned around the tables, growing louder, more pointed. "He used her," one woman hissed, "to cover up his schemes." Another man leaned closer to his companion. "Imagine plotting in front of us, thinking we were all too blind to see." The murmurs swelled, an invisible jury delivering its verdict. Eleanor's lips trembled. She reached for her wine glass, but her hand stopped halfway, falling limp onto the tablecloth. Her eyes never left her son. She didn't need to hear the whispers. The shame written on every face in the room was loud enough. "Nonsense," Nathaniel finally forced out, his voice brittle, his charm splintered. "She misunderstood. She's a waitress. What does she know of contracts or business? You'll take the word of a servant over mine?" But his protest landed flat. No one moved to defend him. Instead, Daniel Brooks stepped forward from the bar, his presence steady and unflinching. His voice cut through the air with quiet authority. "She's not wrong." All heads turned. Daniel's gaze was fixed on Nathaniel, hard as iron. "You signed interest papers weeks ago. Word travels fast in this city. I knew something was coming, but I didn't think you'd dare sit here and laugh about it." Nathaniel's face drained of color. His mask of control crumbled further. Grace stood nearby, silent but resolute, her eyes locked on Eleanor. It was not just her own dignity she had defended. It was Eleanor's as well, reclaiming a language that had been twisted into a weapon of greed. Eleanor's hands rose slowly, painfully, as if weighted with years of silence. She signed just one word this time, her movements sharp and cold: shame. The word struck harder than any slap. Nathaniel recoiled, his breath stuttering as the final thread of his power snapped in front of the very people he had tried to impress. The murmurs erupted into open judgment now. A man pushed back his chair with a scrape. A woman gathered her shawl and shook her head. One by one, diners rose from their tables, their departure a slow exodus of disapproval. Each step away left Nathaniel more isolated, stripped bare under the chandelier's merciless glow. For the first time in his gilded life, Nathaniel Whitmore sat not as the untouchable billionaire CEO, but as a man exposed, small, cornered, and utterly alone. The restaurant, once a stage for Nathaniel's arrogance, shifted into something else entirely. The chandeliers no longer shimmered in his favor. They cast a harsh light that made every bead of sweat on his forehead visible, every tremor in his hand impossible to hide. Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his tall frame steady, his expression carved with years of quiet resilience. He stopped just beside Grace, a subtle gesture that spoke louder than words. She wasn't alone anymore. "Nathaniel," Daniel said evenly, his voice carrying over the restless murmurs, "I built this place with my family's hands. It's the only thing we have left. And you dared to sit here, plotting to take it from me? From them?" He gestured toward the doors, toward the unseen streets beyond where families like the Martins and the Ruizes lived. "You call that business. I call it theft." The crowd hummed in agreement. Chairs scraped back, not in chaos, but in solidarity. For the first time, Nathaniel found himself at the wrong end of power, the collective judgment of people who had once admired him. Grace's hands curled at her sides, her chest still rising and falling with the adrenaline of truth. She felt Daniel's presence beside her like an anchor, steadying her after the storm. Nathaniel tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. "You don't understand how this city works," he spat, though his eyes darted nervously between the faces surrounding him. "Deals are made, land changes hands. It's progress." "Progress doesn't trample people," Daniel shot back. "Progress doesn't silence communities, and it doesn't hide behind a language you thought no one could see." At that, Grace lifted her chin. She signed a single word, truth, before voicing it clearly, her tone steady. "That's what you couldn't hide tonight." Eleanor lowered her gaze, her pearls catching the light as tears welled in her eyes. She reached for her cane, her movements slow but deliberate. Without looking at her son, she pushed back her chair and stood, fragile but firm. Her silence was louder than any outburst, her turning away a sentence heavier than any court's. Nathaniel's hand shot out desperate. "Mother," but she didn't stop. With measured steps, Eleanor crossed the room, her departure igniting a final ripple of disapproval. Guests followed, leaving their half-finished dinners, their untouched wine. The room emptied like a tide receding, each step echoing the collapse of his empire. Grace and Daniel remained facing him. Daniel's voice softened but carried no mercy. "You thought money made you untouchable, but dignity, Nathaniel. Dignity has a power you'll never buy." Nathaniel's shoulders slumped, the arrogance drained from his posture. He looked around at the deserted tables, the broken glass still glinting near his feet, the stain of spilled wine like a scar across the cloth. For once he had nothing to say. Grace gathered her tray, her movements calm, almost ceremonial. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply turned to Daniel, her eyes steady. "It's over." And in that quiet, the reversal was complete. The billionaire who had mocked her was now the man left in ruins, surrounded by nothing but silence and shame. The restaurant was almost empty now. The echo of departing footsteps lingered in the marble hall, mingling with the faint scent of spilled wine. Waiters moved quietly, gathering abandoned plates, but their eyes kept drifting back to Grace as though they were silently acknowledging that tonight she had become something more than just one of them. Nathaniel remained seated, his once perfect posture crumbled. His suit jacket hung awkwardly, his tie loosened, his face pale. The powerful billionaire who had arrived with confidence and cruelty now looked smaller than the chair he occupied. Grace stood a few feet away, her tray pressed lightly against her hip. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was enough. She had already spoken louder than anyone in the room ever had. Daniel Brooks approached Nathaniel's table, resting a steady hand on the polished wood. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of finality. "You won't take this place from me, and you won't touch those families. Not while there are people willing to stand against you." Nathaniel lifted his eyes, red-rimmed and desperate. "You think anyone will believe her, a waitress?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Everyone already did." Grace watched as Nathaniel flinched at the truth. Power was no longer his to command. His empire might still stand on paper, but tonight, here in front of witnesses, his name had been scarred. From the far end of the room, the doors opened softly. Eleanor appeared, leaning on her cane, her steps slow but resolute. She had left earlier, but now she returned, not for him, but for her own dignity. She didn't look at her son. Her gaze found Grace instead. Eleanor signed a single word, her hand trembling but sure. "Thank you." Grace's throat tightened. She lifted her own hands, replying with equal grace, "You deserve better." Eleanor's eyes glistened as she turned away once more, this time not pausing, her figure retreating into the night. Nathaniel half rose from his chair, but the weight of his mother's absence crushed him back down. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. "You saved more than just this restaurant tonight," he said softly. Grace shook her head. "I only spoke the truth." "And that," Daniel replied, "is the hardest thing to do." She exhaled, the tension finally leaving her body. For the first time all night, her hands stopped trembling. She gathered the last of the broken glass, her movements calm, almost reverent, as though closing the chapter with dignity. Nathaniel rose at last, his face hollow, his eyes darting away from every gaze. No one stopped him as he staggered toward the door. His footsteps echoed, lonely and stripped of grandeur. He left the restaurant not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man marked by shame, forever remembered for the night he was exposed by the very person he mocked. Grace straightened, setting the final glass aside. Around her, the restaurant began to breathe again, not with fear, but with quiet solidarity. Daniel gave her a small nod, and she returned it, their unspoken agreement sealing the future. The restaurant would remain, and so would its dignity. Under the fading glow of the chandeliers, Grace allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not of triumph, but of peace. She hadn't won power or wealth. She had won something far greater, her voice, her place, and the unshakable truth. The restaurant stood in silence long after Nathaniel's footsteps faded into the night. The crimson stain on the tablecloth remained, a reminder of the violence of his pride, but the air had changed. What once felt heavy with humiliation now carried the quiet weight of dignity restored. Grace gathered the last of the glasses, her movements calm, no longer trembling under his shadow. She did not need applause or praise. The silence of the guests who remained, the respectful glances exchanged in her direction, were more than enough. She had spoken when it mattered, and that truth could never be silenced again. Daniel Brooks approached her, his voice steady, his presence protective. "You did more than stand up for yourself tonight," he said. "You gave a voice to families who had none, and you reminded us all that power means nothing without integrity." Grace looked at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "I only did what I had to." "And that," Daniel replied, "is what makes it extraordinary." Across the room, Eleanor lingered for a moment, her cane in hand, her pearls glimmering faintly under the chandelier's light. She turned to Grace, her eyes carrying both sorrow and gratitude. Slowly she raised her hands and signed just one word: respect. Then she left without looking back at her son, carrying her dignity with her into the night. Grace exhaled deeply, the storm inside her finally quieting. She wasn't a millionaire, she wasn't powerful, but she held something far greater: the strength of truth, the courage to protect others, and the dignity that no humiliation could erase. That night, the restaurant didn't just survive, it became a symbol of a waitress who refused to bow to cruelty, of a man who tried to buy everything and lost the one thing he could never control, and of a mother who chose honesty over silence. Because in the end, wealth fades, power crumbles, but dignity endures. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.